Hello class. This will just be a brief video introducing the concept of film noir, for those of you who might be unfamiliar. Film noir directly impacts the film we're going to be watching this week, the film called The Naked City. Before we jump in and discuss film noir, remember that you can download this PDF on Blackboard in the weekly materials section of the course. So before we talk about what film noir is and how it works in terms of film, first let's back up and talk about narrative. The books you've been reading and some of our discussions have talked a lot about the narrative of a film, how a film builds a story. So it's important to remember when we're talking about narrative, we're kind of talking about three sort of things. One, that a narrative is what we think of a plot. Characters doing things, actions and reactions, conflicts and resolutions. Next, a narrative can be a type of movie. Narrative films are a subset of movies themselves. Not all films will tell coherent stories using narratives. You may have experimental art films that are just, images and sound going together. And finally, narrative is a way of structuring a film. Even films that might be confusing or have highly complex narratives still have a structure around how they're going to tell the story. So, narrative films all have central characters. The idea that McKendrick talks about when he's talking about character-based conflict resolutions. Narrative films are always based on screenplays. Behavior and dialogue is often predetermined before filming, understanding what the character will be. And the acting is coordinated with the lighting, camera effects, movements, sound, and special effects. In narrative films, you won't have a lot of improvisation. You won't have extemporaneous films. Now, as I said, you can find some of these films that are non-narrative films in film history. Quite often, the experimental art movements of the 60s and 70s is when you'll see a majority of these. But still, 95% of all films you watch will be narrative films. So, now that we have an idea of narrative, what it says, and kind of reminded ourselves of that, let's talk about genre. Right? And when we talk about a film genre, it's a way that we categorize certain types of films. Genre stories offer familiar formulas, conventions, themes, conflicts, and characters that are immediately recognizable to you, the audience. Filmmakers and audience recognize these and group them together to create a genre. And finally, genres are highly dependent on the cultural context that produces them. Genres will be different across international cultures, and own countries and cultures can produce their own genres specific to them. So, when we're looking at a genre, we're looking at certain sort of conventions. We're looking at the story. The way the story is constructed often tells us what type of movie it is. Horror movies have a certain story pattern to them. Action movies have a certain story pattern to them. Next, the themes. Certain themes will become popular across conventions. The hero's journey is an important theme for science fiction and fantasy genres. It's a unifying theme that are found throughout that genre of film. Next, character types. These are specific ways of writing a character that share elements with other characters from other movies in that genre. In romantic comedies, you will see oftentimes the main character be a plucky, quirky main character. In romantic comedies, you could have the character type of the manic pixie dream girl. These are character types shared within that genre. Next, setting. Genres can share settings. It's why we think of horror movies having spooky houses and graveyards and spooky forests. Finally, actors. Certain actors gravitate towards certain genres. when you go see a Tom Cruise movie, you come in expecting an action movie, because that's the genre he is most known for performing in. So now that we have narrative and genre discussed, let's look at the one that The Naked City falls into. That is film noir. So film noir is a specific genre that tells specific narratives that is shared across all films that could be found in film noir. If you Google film noir, you will see tons of examples of film noir. It's an incredibly popular genre of film. But, like anything, film noir did not come about out of nothing. Film noir has its roots in the traditional detective storytelling genre that goes all the way back to characters like Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin and Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. If you haven't read these short stories, you at least know of one of these characters in Sherlock Holmes. But these two characters started a broad range of detective stories that continue to this day. And remember, not all stories featuring police detectives or detectives are film noir. Right? But this was the creation of the detective genre that starts with these writers and leads all the way up to Law and Order. Now, detective stories, like these ones of Sherlock Holmes and Auguste Dupin, they share some qualities. All of these were short stories or journal newspaper short stories, and the emphasis was on plot, especially the famous twist ending when the killer would be exposed or the murderer would be solved. The characters, Sherlock Holmes and Dupin, would also have a detached element in solving the crimes. They approached them almost from a realm of science, observation, and logic, almost as if the murder itself was just some grand puzzle for them to solve. Now, noir came out of this tradition of detective stories, crime stories. And what noir did, it started to arise in the 1930s and continued on, that was sort of its beginning. It really inflected an environment of what we could say crooks, dames, and detectives. So some of its main features were elaborate plots, tough protagonists, and wild and unstable women. In some crime and noir stories that built off the detective stories of an earlier generation, the protagonist could often also be a criminal. So this noir crime fiction, these books, and we're talking about books here, they started to branch off the cold, detached detective novels to present a seedier, more complicated world where the hero detective may not be such a squeaky clean protagonist like Sherlock Holmes. So, noir fiction gave birth to this genre, and it started to give birth to film noir. All right. So, here's a quote on film noir. Film noir is not defined, as are the Western and gangster genres, by conventions of setting and conflict, but rather by the more subtle qualities of tone and mood. Next quote. Noir is a lean, direct style of writing. The self-destructive qualities of the characters and the emphasis on sexual relations advance the plot. So essentially, these two quotes by people who have studied noir are going to tell you that when you watch a noir crime film, like The Naked City, which we're going to watch, this is not necessarily as easy a plot as you do when watching Sherlock Holmes or Law and Order. It's not a game for the detectives to be solved. Instead, the movies, noir fiction and film, are going to enmesh you in the emotions and tone of the crime. You know, the passions of the murderer. You know, the greed of the people who look the other way. The frustration of the police not being able to solve things. You know, these are the tones and emotions that drive noir genre movies. And quite heavily noir fiction, more so than other crime fiction you may watch or read. Noir likes to deal with the sexual dynamic of the murder. Murders will be of women, murders of revenge, of love, and so forth. So, let's break down some of these film noir conventions. All right, it was brought about by a World War II focus away from basic cops and robbers movies, we could say. It had the creation of the hard-boiled detective. Usually the characters we see are down and out, including the protagonists. There will be a femme fatale, a woman who is dangerous that attracts and drives the plot. They will take place primarily in an urban landscape, and they will typically include voiceover narration. When we talk about voiceover narration, that is 9 times out of 10, usually a non-diegetic voice that speaks to you to explain what you're seeing on the film. So, noir characters. Our heroes will not necessarily be heroes in a traditional sense. We will have complicit and morally gray characters. We don't have good guys or bad guys. We have people who exist in shades of gray. Our antagonist in noir films will often be the same, a combination of good or bad. Oftentimes they are the most literal definitions of the antagonist as just a force that is providing conflict to the desires of the protagonist. Finally, noir fiction often lacks dynamic characters in that these characters are dragged around by the machinations of the crime. The crime kind of catches all of the characters in a web, and the characters can't ever escape the crime. And finally, when we talk about characters that are quote-unquote hard-boiled, we mean that sort of like an egg. Tough on the outside when you hard-boil an egg, but brittle and prone to cracking mentally. So the characters that we see in noir are hard, tough characters, but usually it's a fragile toughness. It's a weak emotional state that can be broken and shattered. Next, let's look at imagery. Noir, meaning black, isn't just for the confused, conflicted world in which our characters reside. It also affects the visual dynamics of a noir film. Noir films will often employ lighting schemes that emphasize high contrast, deep blacks, bright whites, lots of shadows. Think of the scene that we watched in Metropolis where Rotwang is chasing Maria with the flashlight, the lantern sort of. Think of that type of lighting. Really dark darks, really bright lights. Illumination will reveal facial features and cast shadows. So they use light to both reveal elements of the plot, but also hide them. Exterior scenes almost always take place at night. You will see scenes at night using that darkness. And then finally, in terms of sound, the voiceover narration of noir films, the voiceover telling you what the characters are doing, oftentimes doesn't reveal the truth. It only will talk about the confusion of the characters. Next up, setting. Setting, when we talk about film, is of course the place or location of the action. The setting can be the historical cultural context of the characters. Setting can also help us symbolize the emotional state of the characters. Now, films will have multiple settings. Every scene could be technically in a different setting. And it helps to think of settings from going large to small. So, for instance, we could say a setting in the film The Naked City would be the city of New York. Then underneath that, we could say the setting could be a police station. And then underneath that, the setting could be the interrogation room in the police station. Picture a upside down triangle, and that will help you understand setting. More importantly, what you should look for as you watch The Naked City, since it's a noir film, look to see how the setting of New York City helps build the tone of the film, how it helps build the world of the movie which we will watch. All right. Next, in a setting, it's always better if you notice something that is going to be symbolic, you should take a look at it. Bridges, building, parks, landscapes, statues, anything that could that the camera focuses on could help build the symbolic weight of the film. Next is Noir Women. As we talked about, one of the key elements of the film noir genre is the trope of a sort of sexually charged murder. So it isn't just a murder over money. It's a murder where money and sex and romance is all entangled within the web of the crime. And usually at the center of this web is the noir woman. The noir woman oftentimes is most commonly known to as the femme fatale. The femme fatale is the type of characterization of women where they are drawing in the male characters around them, usually to some form of self-destructive element. Some of the common tropes that we will see with women in noir films. And not every woman is a femme fatale, but even if they're non-femme fatale characters, they will often have these tropes about them. So women in noir films are usually attractive and seductive. Dangerous because of their ability to inflame the passions of the male characters, but still caught in a patriarchal world where they are kind of held passively. Oftentimes they will present a bored or laconic attitude, being sort of hiding their insecurities or fear behind a veneer of coolness. They will often seek to entrap the male characters around them into their problems, and will always be connected to wealthy and dangerous men. So here are two quotes about how noir women have impacted the psychology of noir films. First quote, the scenario of the duplicitous woman as femme fatale affords, as well as the pleasure of passivity which arise from being enthralled to her promise of love, pleasures which are no doubt also masochistic. The violent retribution so often enacted upon the femme fatale by the plot and or the male hero bears witness not so much to the patriarchal ideology as to man's inverse desire to control and punish the objects of desire who has unmanned him by arousing such passive desire. So what Copy is talking about here is that when women are murdered in noir films, they are oftentimes murdered because the man is aroused and wants to have them sexually. But for some reason, whether it's a societal reason or a reason of the plot, feels that this desire is thwarted. Maybe the man is married. Maybe the woman is married. Maybe the woman rejects him. And so this arousal of his desire leads to a feeling of punishing that. So the sort of self-loathing that the man has in his desire towards the woman ends up allowing the man to sort of punish this object of desire. Right? Zizek's quote follows along in the same manner. If you note when you read Zizek's quote, which can be a bit confusing, he's talking about how the self-destructive aspect of the femme fatale is less about the woman character herself. It's about the suicidal gestures of the main character. The male characters often take out their insecurities and their unconscious desires in women of noir films. So that's something that you should pay attention to as you watch The Naked City. In the central murder case, how are men taking out their desires on the women around them? So that's our end of our brief discussion of noir films. Come back, check this slideshow out after you've watched the film The Naked City, because you're going to see a lot of similarities and differences to that film as a noir film.